how to grow your business with podcasting in today's episode with Tom Fox. Welcome to Awakened Titans podcast with Lily Patrascu. Mind-blowing conversations with influential business titans sharing how you can manifest abundance, love, joy, success through quantum awakening, quantum manifestation, quantum healing, quantum miracles, exponential business growth, and innovative products and services. Tom Fox is the voice of compliance, having founded the only podcast network in compliance. And he's the founder of Compliance Podcast Network. It currently has 60 podcasts. Tom has won multiple awards for podcast hosting and producing and was honored with a Webby for his series looking back on 9/11. He's an executive leader at the C-Suite Network, the world's most trusted network of C-Suite leaders. He's also the co-founder of the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. The first question is, what first inspired you to start using podcasting as a tool for business growth?
Well, I can't really say I was inspired. It was actually a natural extension of blogging. I started my consulting practice in 2010. I was laid up from a bad injury and I couldn't leave the house except to go to physical therapy. So I started using social media. And within 6 months, I'd built up a worldwide consulting practice in the area of anti-corruption compliance. Very exciting, I know. But I started blogging every day. And in 2012, it just seemed like a natural extension to move to podcasting.
Thank you. And tell us more about your journey to creating 60 podcasts. Can I ask you, all of these podcasts, are they about the same topic, kind of similar names? Like, are they sort of about different sub-niches of compliance, or are they all about different topics?
They're all about legal and regulatory compliance. When I started the network in 2017, there was a magic number of 30,000 downloads a month to get revenue through advertising dollars. And I knew I would never get 30,000 downloads a month for a legal and regulatory compliance podcast. So my vision was, well, I'll get 10 podcasts and I'll get 3,000 a month. And the problem with that is I have one switch, it's on and off. And so if I think of something, I have to start a new podcast. So it just sort of blossomed out. And so I have the FCPA Compliance Report, which is an anti-corruption podcast. I have daily compliance news. I have weekly compliance news wrap-up. I have compliance tip of the day. I have Winnie the Pooh in compliance, Star Trek in compliance, Star Wars in compliance, sports in compliance, Shakespeare in compliance, innovation in compliance, great women in compliance, different types of corruption-focused true crime podcasts. I have creativity in compliance. I have Two Gurus Talk Compliance. I have Big Brains Talk Compliance. I have ComTech for compliance. I have AI in compliance. I have data-driven compliance. So I slice it and dice it about as many ways as you can. But it really all starts with, if I come up with a new idea, I have to start a new podcast.
Wow. You know what? I so love that you have started this network, because I started this podcast only about 2 months ago. And what's funny about it is that I was, because I'm so creative, I was thinking about, okay, I can do one about healing, I can do about manifestation, I can do one about AI. And I couldn't quite figure out how to kind of make them all feel like they're part of a certain umbrella. So can I ask you, what do you recommend for entrepreneurs who want to follow your same path of building a network of podcasts and not focus just on one podcast, which is what typically most entrepreneurs do?
Well, the key is, for me, and I think it really translates to a lot of other entrepreneurs, is to go big, go small. So I focus on the incredibly narrow area of legal and regulatory compliance, and I own that space. In fact, there's no other podcast network in that space. There are other podcasts. But if the smaller and more niche you can go, the more you will own that space, because advertisers in that space know you have the exact target audience that they want. So they will advertise on your podcast. They will sponsor your podcast. They will work with you in a wide variety of ways. So it's really go small to go big.
Wow, I love that. Can you explain how podcasting can be a powerful medium for growing a business?
Sure. So there are 5 different types of podcasts. There's relationship building podcasts. There's audience engagement podcasts. There's thought leadership podcasts. There's conversion podcasts, and there's content podcasts. So the first thing you need to do is figure out which one of those you want. If you want to be, I started out wanting to be seen as a thought leader. Certainly for a consultant and a solo entrepreneur consultant, that's an appropriate method to utilize, is to show your thought leadership in the area of compliance. And I had written several books by that time, so I could talk about it. The relationship building podcast is if you happen to be a corporation and I want to do business with you, I send you an email that says, "Dear Lily, my name is Tom Fox. I have this consulting business. I'd love to talk to you." You may or may not respond. If I send you an email that says, "Lily, my name is Tom Fox. I have this podcast about legal and regulatory compliance. It fits directly into what you do. I'd like you to come on my podcast and talk about you." You will get 100% response, and it will be 100% positive. So it's a great way for you to build relationships. The same concept applies to engaging with your audience. If you want to give them information and then some sort of written giveaway that could lead you to getting them in a sales funnel, you can do that. And recognizing if you have a sales funnel, you have a product to sell, and you still have to sell the product, but you can at least develop the engagement with your audience. A conversion podcast is taking that a little bit further and actually converting them into a customer. And then there are content podcasts where you want to create content. So actually, I've written 33 books in this arena, and people say, "How on earth do you do that?" Well, here's how I do it. Everything is a part of a content creation process. So if I do a podcast, I get a transcript. That transcript forms the first draft of a paper, of a blog. Well, if I put 5 podcasts together, I have 5 different blogs. Well, now I've got a white paper. Well, if I do that for more than 5, I have enough to get a chapter in a book. And so everything I do is geared towards an eventual book, whether it is in legal and regulatory compliance, whether it is in certain court cases that caught my attention. I've even used it to help a guy write his autobiography. So content creating podcasts, if properly utilized, can lead to multiple media forms, both in a video podcast, an audio podcast, social media marketing assets, white papers, and books.
Thank you. How can entrepreneurs monetize a podcast?
So monetization of podcasts can come in a couple of different forms. Actually, that's not true, multiple forms. And I'll tell you what my revenue streams are. One is if a company wants to come on my podcast, there's an appearance fee. And second, if they want to sponsor the podcast, that means they get an ad read. That's a specific cost. It goes down the more episodes you sponsor. So if it's a one time, it's one fee. And if it's a month, it's something less than the one-time fee times 4. And then if it's 3 months, I even discount it more. Then if someone wants to sponsor an entire podcast where they get an ad read with every podcast, plus I give them one guest slot a month, that's another revenue source. And then the final one that I don't think entrepreneurs take enough advantage of is social media marketing content creation. So in my space of legal and regulatory compliance, most vendors are software providers of some sort. And they are large enough to have a CMO, chief marketing officer, but typically that's the only thing they have. They don't have any people who are actually creating the content. So I create the content for them. And I mentioned if you come on my podcast, you're going to get a minimum of 20 social media marketing assets. You're going to get videograms. You're going to get social media shares. You're going to get show notes. You're going to get LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram posts that you can utilize throughout your own social media presence. Plus, everything goes out through my network, and I have 50,000 daily followers. So it's going to be the target that you want to talk to.
Thank you. How is podcasting different to other marketing strategies?
A couple of different ways. Amazingly enough, audio listening is viewed as the most trusted source for marketing. More trusted than video, more trusted than television, more trusted than live streaming, more trusted. I'm a lawyer by professional background, even more trusted than the printed word, which it pains me to say that. But people like to hear something, and it gives them, I don't want to sound too creepy or anything else, but there's an intimacy to podcasting. You are literally in someone's head. Even if you're wearing earbuds, you're listening to them, and somehow that creates a greater sense of trust so that the podcast format allows you to communicate your marketing piece or message in a way that you can't do in a printed page, whether it's a newspaper, a magazine, or anything, or even a social media share. In addition, it's more valuable than YouTube or other video formats, Spotify or wherever else you may be on. So somehow that audio component resonates with people.
Thank you. For someone starting a podcast from scratch, how should they approach starting out?
So I get asked that question all the time. And here's my answer. You get off your duff and you start a podcast. It's that simple, literally. So I'm a Mac guy. I have a Mac computer. Well, everything you need for a podcast is on your Mac. There's software, there's audio editing called GarageBand. There's video editing tools. You can do a Zoom call. If you can do a Zoom call, you can do a podcast. And now I use more sophisticated podcast recording software, but that cost is relatively cheap. And for certainly $500, you can start a podcast. The biggest expense, and the one thing I would suggest you spend money on, is a quality microphone, because your audio quality matters. But you can buy those. I think $150 will get you an adequate quality microphone to do podcasting. The key is don't overthink it. Don't worry about it. Don't spend a year and a half doing market analysis about who's going to listen to you. Get off your duff. Start talking.
Thank you. What are the biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make when podcasting?
So I don't think there are mistakes. I think they're all learning. Now, when I go back and look at podcasts from 2012, not only do I cringe, I can barely look and or listen to myself talk. I was so bad. But that's just practice. And I think if you call it a mistake, I call it a learning opportunity. So if you, I think the one mistake we've all made to our chagrin is forget to hit that red button to record. So that's one that's hard to come back from. I once flew to Boston to interview a Harvard professor, and 2 hours later, I realized I hadn't turned on the recording button. So he was not very impressed with me. But make sure your recording button is turned on. And I just don't think there are too many mistakes to make. It's all going to help you grow as an interviewer, as a writer of show notes, as a social media marketer.
Thank you. You've grown a podcast network on compliance. Do you recommend for people that want to create a podcasting network like you, that they would focus on niches potentially that are unrelated? For example, one on health, one on business, one on other topics that are dating, I don't know.
So
or
I
do you suggest they stick to one subject and do only one podcast?
Well, I have two podcast networks. And so that's how I've answered that question, by just starting a second podcast network. I live in a rural part of West Texas. So I started a rural podcast network to focus on rural issues. Probably doesn't lend itself to a corporate compliance or corporate legal audience, but the rural part focuses on, this other aspect. So if you're really passionate about some subject, and you ticked off several you were passionate about when we started this podcast, just start a different network. And remember, it's your network. You can do what you want.
Thank you. What can entrepreneurs do in order to find the right niche for them?
Well, it really starts with who is your target customer. If you're an entrepreneur, I'm going to assume you have something to sell. And so that's what you want to target, whoever that is and however you can get to them. But here's the one trick I did learn. If you want to absolutely positively own, and I mean own your space, Here's what you do. You start a daily news podcast, whatever area you are in. So mine is compliance. So I have the daily compliance news. It's 4 stories. It's 5 minutes. It takes me about 15 minutes to do a daily news show because I have the intro and I have the outro, and I just put in 4 stories, and they're 4 stories I pick, and people absolutely love it. I mean, people text me, "Oh, I listen to you when I'm shaving in the morning," or "I listen to you on my commute." But you will absolutely own your space. And I had someone ask me in a podcast conference once, "Well, I podcast about veterans with PTSD." I said, "Perfect. You do a daily podcast on veterans with PTSD. There will be no end of stories." And I would like to tell you, I thought up this idea myself, but as in law, in podcasting, there are no new ideas. I had a friend who did a daily Indiana basketball podcast. And I thought, if you can do a daily Indiana basketball podcast, you can do a daily podcast on anything.
Thank you. How did you find your first 100 listeners? And what do you recommend entrepreneurs do in order to increase the number of listeners and subscribers?
So I got my listeners because I had a blog post following. So I already had a website. I already had followers. So my first 100 was relatively straightforward. It was just people who were already reading me. In terms of growing your podcast, I think it's all organic and it's all incremental. So one thing would be to go on people's podcasts like yourself. Go talk about yourself, talk about your podcast, talk about your network, talk about what you want to do. Meet as many other podcasters and do pod swaps as you can. That's one way. The other way is to whatever type of podcast you want to have, whether it's thought leadership, conversion, content, relationship building, really focus on that and demonstrate to your audience, I am a trusted voice that you can listen to. But I would say the most important thing is the following. Whatever cadence you set for the release of your podcast, you have to follow that. So if you say, I'm going to release a podcast every other Wednesday at 10 a.m., you have to release a podcast. That means if at 9:30 on Wednesday morning, you don't have a podcast, get off your duff and do something, because your cadence is your promise to your audience that every Wednesday at 10 a.m., Tom Fox is going to have a podcast on great women in compliance. And people are going to expect that. And if you don't meet that expectation, you will break your promise to them as a listener.
Thank you. Can you share more tips on promoting the podcast to ensure it reaches the right people?
So if you have a business podcast, frankly, you cannot do better than LinkedIn. The people who are your followers hopefully will be people in your industry that you either follow or others follow you. And so LinkedIn is a premier platform for getting your podcast out, but it's social media. It is Facebook. It is Instagram. I'm not a TikTok guy. Maybe it works on TikTok. I don't know. But LinkedIn, and when I started in 2012, Twitter was much more business focused than it is now. But I still find Twitter to be incredibly valuable for getting the message out. But it's hammer social media. And one of the things that happened to me was during the pandemic, I didn't have anything else to do, literally, because I had no work. And so I spent 4 to 6 hours a day on social media and just reposting clips on my podcast. And that really helped in the growth as well. I don't do that anymore, but I hired somebody to do it.
Thank you. How do you keep listeners engaged and coming back for more?
So I have 2 criteria only for a successful podcast. Number 1, how much did I learn? Number 2, how much fun did I have? Now, the learning part is so important, is people come to my podcast to learn. As I mentioned, I've written 33 books in this field, and I know a lot. Not that I'm the smartest guy, but I talk to the smartest people. And if having written 33 books, including the definitive handbook on compliance, if I'm learning something, there's a good chance my audience is learning something. But the real key is fun. And they say people come for the guest, but they stay for the host. And the reason they stay for the host is if I'm having fun, it's in my voice. You can tell. I don't mean laughing or guffawing. I mean, if I'm engaged, and just like you and I are doing this sort of rapid fire dialogue, people enjoy that. And people think that's fun to listen to. And that if I'm having fun, my audience is going to be engaged. So for me, it is how much did I learn and how much fun did I have?
Thank you. What other ways are there for a podcast to generate revenue besides sponsorship, ads, and everything you mentioned earlier?
Well, I wrote a book this summer, and that book came from multiple podcast episodes. And when I had about finished the book, which I was going to publish, someone said, why don't you call up one of the businesses in your space and see if they want to sponsor your book for a lot of money? And they said, we'd love to. So you can take the content you create and get a business in your space to sponsor you. And it was, I don't want to say like found money, but it was a new revenue source for me because I had the book. They were paying for the book. They paid to have it published. And we did a full podcast series based upon the kind of conclusions I came to in the book.
Wow, that's amazing. How can podcasting be used to convert listeners into paying customers, aside from what you just said?
Well, the key is, one, that you have quality information. So if I'm the guest, I want to have, or the host, I want to have a quality guest, or I want to be giving good information. But the key to the conversion part is get them into your sales funnel by giving them some value add. I mean by that is give them a white paper, give them an infographic, give them an audio, give them a something that helps them answer a question or solve a problem. And to get that, they have to go behind a gate and give you their name and address or name and email. So now you've captured their contact information. Now it's still up to you to sell. But once you've got them in the sales funnel, then you can say, Lily, I want to talk to you about the software product I have. And you'll probably at least give me that courtesy because of the relationship we've developed through the podcast format.
Thank you. What's the best way to leverage podcast content to build relationships with potential clients or partners?
Well, it's really, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you email someone and say, I want you to come on my podcast and talk about you, they're going to get a 100% success rate. Well, now you've got a relationship with that person. And cold call them. You're going to call them up and say, hey, it's Tom. I'd like to talk to you about whatever it might be. You might want to have them on for an additional podcast. You might want to say, I think there's some ways we could partner up on this project. You said that you're developing X. Well, I'm developing Y. What if we kind of developed it together? In today's creator economy, you don't have to create this huge legal joint venture or partnership agreement to do one project. You can get together for a quick project, make a few bucks, get some content out of it, and create a way.
Thank you. What are some of the best lead generation tools that can be used during podcasting?
So this is always a difficult question because every podcast network is different. Some will give you name. Some will give you name and title. Some will give you name and company. If they're a subscriber, you get an email. Apple, you get nothing. So it can be very frustrating trying to capture that information. But that information is available. You just have to go into each platform and figure it out. And it took me years to do that. And I finally did that last year.
Thank you. How important is storytelling in podcasting and how storytelling can translate into more leads, sales, and clients?
I think storytelling is all a part of the quality of your content. And if you can tell a story which helps illustrate what a problem is and more importantly, what your solution is, I think it's going to make people more interested in doing business with you. If you have a software solution or a tech solution, they're going to be more interested in hearing about it. But storytelling is engagement. And if you can engage your audience, your listener, that's how you're going to move them to becoming at the top of your funnel, to the middle of your funnel, hopefully the sales side of your funnel.
Thank you. How do you structure a podcast episodes to ensure that it adds value to listeners while subtly promoting your business?
Well, I don't promote my business on a podcast. But I structure, so my podcasts are business, B2B podcasts with information and solution about compliance. I do not play got you. I'm not a journalist. I'm here to celebrate the person I'm talking to, and I'm here to celebrate their company and what their company has done. I tell people, don't worry about sounding like an infomercial. That's not your responsibility. That's mine as the host. And so my podcast, I write an outline for every podcast, and I give that to my guest for their review and approval. There's no surprises. And it's along the lines of the following: one, kind of professional background and current role. Two, what is their company and what does their company do? Is it a tech company? Is it a piece of software? Is it a services? Whatever it may be. Three is taking the solutions that their companies offer and wedding or marrying them to the problems that exist in the compliance community. And then four is always looking down the road. So, where do you see compliance in 5 years? What would you tell someone in college to focus on if they wanted this type of career? Those four general categories, and it's usually 20 to 30 minutes.
Thank you. How can podcasting be used as a networking tool?
Well, with a networking tool, that's where you're getting back into the audience engagement. And what you want to do there is bring people together, hopefully to create a community. And I have to brag on two women who are in my network that about 7 years ago, they came to me at a compliance conference and said, "You don't have enough diversity. You need women on your network." And I said, "You're right. When are you going to start your podcast?" And they said, No, we didn't mean that. I said, "I meant it." And so I got them to start a podcast, and it's called literally Great Women in Compliance. And it focuses just on that. But here's what they did that was so brilliant. They created a LinkedIn community, Great Women in Compliance, and it became a community for women in compliance. It was 2017, and that didn't exist. Well, the first year after the pandemic, at a compliance conference, their little community was so popular that they let them do a presentation on how they built this community. The next year, that presentation was so popular, they let them do a 3-hour workshop, including lunch, on women supporting women in compliance. That was so popular that this same company then created a 2-day conference of women in compliance. And I tell people those women changed the world by creating a community that didn't exist. I met a woman this summer who has the Women in Podcasting Network, and she created a Canadian woman named Jennifer Hensel, and she created a series of awards for women in podcasting. There aren't awards dedicated to that in the B2B space. There are, awards in other areas. And so she's created an entire community of women B2B podcasters. And I think it's just saying, here's the community I want to create, engaging that audience, and then getting those audience members to cross-engage with each other.
Thank you. What are the best practices for inviting and interviewing guests on a podcast in a way that it strengthens business relationships?
Well, in terms of inviting, you just say, Lily, I want you to come on my podcast and talk about you. Everybody says yes to that. In terms of, then you just sort of try to get them comfortable. And that's one reason for an outline. I use the outline myself because that forms the basis of, my next level of writing after I get the draft or the transcript rather. So I find that everybody wants to talk about themselves. And the more you can make them at ease, I tell people it's just virtual cup of coffee with Tom. So since we're doing this after lunch, my time, no coffee today. I'm coffeeed out. But if it's in the morning, you'd see me with a cup of coffee. And I even now have my own branded podcast coffee. So everybody kind of knows that's my joke is cup of coffee with Tom.
Wow, I love it. What's one piece of advice you wish you knew when you started podcasting?
It's been this just fabulous journey. And like I tried to say before, if I've made mistakes, they've been learning experiences. So I guess can't come up with a good answer for that.
What's next for you in the podcasting space? And how do you continue evolving your podcast to keep driving growth for your business?
Well, let me answer the second part of that first. I am intensely curious. I love to learn, and I will never stop learning. And so I always want to learn about new things. I want to talk to new people. I started an AI podcast where I get to explore, cutting edge AI for compliance. So I'm going to always be evolving and doing new pods because I enjoy learning. In terms of where I want to take the network, I'd like to see if I could break it out of the compliance niche to a wider corporate audience, because I believe that effective legal ethics and compliance equates to greater business efficiency, which means greater profitability or greater ROI. And if I could get that message across to CEOs and other people who are not compliance officers, I think that would be a big step forward for me.
Follow us for more interviews with world's most influential business titans, providing you with the insights to awaken to your full potential, so you can get paid to be yourself, find true happiness, and manifest anything you desire.